Hello and welcome to ABS Africa Broadcasting Service, coming to you from the great state of Texas, precisely from Houston. It's a pleasure, as usual, to come to you with events and news taking place in the continent of Africa. Once more, welcome to the broadcast, and I'd like to welcome all of you who are tuning in from north to the south of Africa, from the east to the west of the continent. Today, we're going to be discussing some very, very critical issues taking place in the continent, precisely in Ethiopia, Somaliland, and the Cameroons. The Cameroons here referring to French Cameroon, known as La République du Cameroon, and the southern Cameroons, known by the people as Ambazonia. I will be having a very special guest tonight to bring us some insight into the diplomacy surrounding events in Somaliland, events in the Ethiopia, and of course the Cameroons. Again, once more, good evening and welcome. Again, ladies and gentlemen, we are having a very, very special guest here tonight. I'm speaking about the former Under Secretary of State in the U.S. in charge of African Affairs, Ambassador Tibor Nagy. He will be joining me in a few minutes to discuss events in Ethiopia, in Somaliland, and in the southern Cameroons. As you are aware, Somaliland has gone for 30 years and counting, I believe, seeking, as an independent country, but still seeking recognition from the international community. Ethiopia has gone through conflict after conflict. At a moment in time, we thought Ethiopia was settling down to peace. Ethiopia escalated, crisis escalated, and Ethiopia is back into the news. In the southern Cameroons, we have a long-drawn battle between La République du Cameroon and the southern Cameroons, Ambazonia, going through a 5-year war, and counting, also with Ambazonians seeking a country of their own. We will have Ambassador Tibor again give us his take on events in these countries. Ambassador Tibor, sir, it's a great pleasure to have you here on the ABS Africa Broadcasting Service. Good afternoon, sir, from Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, Chris. I wish I could be there in Texas with you, because here in Washington, we're having a major snowstorm today. And of course, Texas is my home state in the United States. And, greetings to all in Texas.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador, again, it's a great pleasure to have you here at ABC. We will delve into the issues right away. We're trying to cover a little bit much in the short time that you have with us here. Ambassador, I will start with this tweet that you put out a few days ago. That was precisely New Year's Eve. And this is what you said. You wrote, Ethiopia, my top 5 prayers for 2022. Ethiopia, peace, end to suffering. Cameroon, above, attention from IC. I guess that is Cameroon government coming to its senses. Somalia and Southern Sudan, governments which care about their people. Sudan, success for handout. We'll leave it there, and you go about to talk about Somaliland there. If you can give us insight to what you were exactly trying to say here, Ambassador.
Yeah. First of all, a very important point. We have to underline that I no longer speak for the United States government, because my time as Assistant Secretary ended last January. So, now my opinions are my own. We have some long-term U.S. policies, which of course we can talk about. What I was trying to say there, obviously I have a long list of prayer concerns, but those were my top 5 for Africa for 2022 and moving forward. Some of them are relatively new. Some of them have been around for a long time. Some of them cover the period when I was Assistant Secretary, and they cover tragic issues. For example, Cameroon, which our administration was not able to do anything about. And I'm very much hoping that the new administration, and especially with Ambassador Chris Lamora going out there to Yaoundé, will be able to have much more success with.
Thank you. When you mention Ethiopia and the Southern Sudan, Ethiopia, we know, had a period of relative peace until recently, I guess in the past 18 months when crisis really escalated. What do you want to see happen in Ethiopia?
Well, what I would... I wish we could all get into a time machine and go back and stop this before it started. I have also characterized this as probably one of the most needless wars in history. We could talk for hours about the historical forces, the dynamics, the ethnic dimensions at play here. What I would like to see more than anything else is that we have come to a point in the conflict where the TPLF made a play to try to threaten Addis Ababa. They were not successful in doing that. They have now withdrawn to Tigray. The federal government has said that they will not pursue the TPLF forces into Tigray. So we are at a moment of, a type of a stalemate, which might present an ideal opportunity to have actually a legal ceasefire and an armistice, and then the sides could undertake some serious discussions on how to move forward, because, common sense dictates that this conflict will end. All conflicts end eventually. The question is, does it end now or does it go on for a long, long time? For example, the conflict in Somalia. So it is a moment which should not be lost, because every day further in this conflict builds up hatred, builds up resentment, makes it more difficult to start some kind of a reconciliation. When the conflict started, it was between the federal government and the TPLF. Unfortunately, this has been now ethnicized to where some non-Tigrayan Ethiopians look at Tigrayans as the enemy. The Tigrayans, they are flying the flag of that their region has been targeted for genocide. And others say that all TPLF members are terrorists, all Tigrayans are terrorists. It is a terrible situation, but right now it seems that Ethiopia truly is at a crossroads. If it turns in one direction, it will not only be more of the same suffering, but it will be much worse suffering. And if it turns in the other direction, there is a possibility to end the suffering right now. So that's basically what I would like to see.
Wonderful. We will come back to that in a kind of a summary, but I'd like to show you something that you said recently about Somaliland. Let me see, I can put that up. You had this to say about Somaliland. Somaliland deserves a United Nations sponsored independence referendum, same as Eritrea had in 1993. International recognition of its success as a functioning state and nation long overdue. Let the people decide. Ambassador Nagy, sir, Somaliland is, I believe, the most peaceful and secure when you compare it to Somalia. Somaliland has gained independence, has obtained its own independence for over 30 years, with about 4 or 5 times free presidential elections. I was there a few months ago, and I saw their economy, I saw what goes on in the political system, and I can say that politically and economically, they are even more stable than Somalia. The people of Somaliland has demonstrated so that they can govern themselves. Why do they need a referendum?
Well, I wish you could make the argument you just made in front of the African Union. Whether it's a referendum or not a referendum, they need a process that is recognized by the international community to move them from the category of a de facto country to a de jure country. And I'm sure you understand the difference, and I think most of the viewers do as well. Because right now, as you said, Somaliland is a functioning state. As a matter of fact, I am not an international attorney, but if we look at history, we can say that Somaliland existed as a de facto legal country for, I believe, at least 1 week before Somalia itself became a country, and
right.
The two joined together. So what I'm getting at is it is way past time to have some kind of an international process that could put that international stamp of approval on Somaliland to say that, okay, now you are a de jure state. You're welcome to join the African Union. You're welcome to join the United Nations, because that is what has been missing. And I know that it has been tremendously frustrating to all the Somalilanders. I'll tell you a very brief story. When I was ambassador in Ethiopia back in, I think this was around 2000, I had the privilege to know the first president of Somaliland, President Igal. And he was, I met with him several times, and he was so frustrated because he could not get the United States to give him any kind of attention. And I had the misfortune to tell him, I said, Mr. President, here's the problem. Somaliland does not have any problems. It does not have any terrorists. It does not destabilize its neighbors. It doesn't have a security problem. And he looked at me and he said, you mean if we had terrorists in Somaliland, then the United States would work with us? And I said, exactly. So, I could understand his deep frustration. And that has basically been the history of Somaliland. I call them the little country that can. They're very much a can-do country. They do not cause anybody any serious problems. They're taking care of their own affairs. They are thriving without any international development assistance. Recently, they received, I know, a major infusion of investments from the port of Dubai. So they're doing it. They are running their country more successfully than, I don't want to put a percentage, but a large percentage of other countries in the world. Let's not just say Africa. And there's this frustration that they cannot get international recognition, because I know there is a whole line of countries that would be willing to be the second country to recognize them. The problem is getting that number one. And I know that recently they established relations with Taiwan, and I know that there are practical reasons for doing that. But because of the one China policy, Taiwan also has very limited international recognition as an independent country. So, there we are.
Yeah, Ambassador, you are correct. And I think the sentiments that by now Somaliland should be recognized is quite huge out there. And you recall that Somaliland is the only country in the region that has no China relations in the area. And shouldn't you think that the USA should take advantage of that and do something? And the other question would be, what stops the US from saying to the rest of the world, Somaliland has demonstrated it can rule herself. Let's recognize her and recognize her. Because you know, if the U.S. does that, the rest of the world will follow, isn't it?
Yeah, as I said, I think there are a number of countries that are willing to be number two, but here's the problem. Remember, I'm not speaking for the U.S. government, okay? So I'm just going to talk about practicalities here. You and I both know that the African Union is viscerally opposed to Somaliland independence because of a whole range of reasons, but the fundamental reason is they are scared to death that would then encourage secessionist movements in other countries that are member states of the African Union. So that is a tremendous challenge to overcome, is to get the African Union to accept Somaliland. And that's why I was mentioning a referendum, because remember, the African Union embraced Eritrea's independence after the referendum. So that's one. American government, and again, I'm not speaking for the government, I'm supposing the American government does not want hostile relations with the African Union, because in effect, the African Union represents, what, 51 independent countries in Africa. So that is one of the biggest problems to overcome. On the other hand, you mentioned a very practical reason why it would make a certain amount of sense for the American government to recognize Somaliland. And I am optimistic that in the next couple of years, that there will be some positive movement in that direction.
Now, talking about the African Union, Mr. Ambassador, you served in Africa for so many years. I think your political career was essentially spent in Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ethiopia. You can name the rest. And you know,
Zambia, Cameroon, Togo, Seychelles, Zimbabwe, right. Let's go.
Right. And you know that when it comes to these conflicts and crises in Africa, the African Union has largely remained dormant, doing almost nothing. For example, in Cameroon, where this conflict has been going on for 5 years and counting now, the African Union hasn't as much as called for a kind of hearing to see how a solution can be provided. Instead, it is Europe, it is the USA talking about how a solution could come in. Where is the place of the African Union in this conflict? Why does it have to be Europe or the USA? And why is the Americans and the Europeans not holding Africa accountable for the problems in the continent?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question, because at the end of the day, it should be the African Union that should be looking at these problems. I cannot betray some of my private conversations when I was Assistant Secretary of State, but I think I also said on my Twitter account that among my greatest regrets of not being able to help resolve an issue was the one in Cameroon, exactly because of that. And all I can say is I did my best to interest as much of the international community as possible to take a much, much more proactive approach in Cameroon. As to why the African Union itself doesn't get engaged in that, I think that question has to go to the officials of the African Union. Part of the answer is all you have to do is look at the membership of the African Union and see, who some of the longest serving heads of state are, how long they have been in their positions as heads of state. And of course, they have a certain amount of influence. So, I remember, and I'm sure you remember the old Organization of African Union
within the African setting, Mr. Ambassador.
No, I'm not saying corruption within the African Union. So what I'm saying is that, like the United Nations, the African Union has to respond to all of its members. And if you look at some of those members, I would posit that some of those members are not leaders in democracy.
That's a little interesting. But then, when you talk about leaders in democracy, shouldn't the African Union be pushing for that kind of leadership in the continent? But you find a situation where the African Union essentially rubber stamps everything politically that happens in every country in the continent.
Absolutely agree with you. But again, you have to go to that institution, and the institution has to reform itself. It's not going to be the United States and Europe that are going to be pointing fingers at them. Because if you remember, it would be very difficult, especially for the Europeans, to point fingers because of the history of colonialism. And let's be honest, for the United States to point fingers, we also have that period of history called the East-West power rivalry, when Africa was basically a chessboard between the Soviet Union and the West.
But Mr. Ambassador, sir, I mean, you have served in the system and you know the influence, tremendous influence that the West, talking about the USA and Europe, wears over Africa. How come the West can exploit Africa, the resources, the leadership, but when it comes to democracy, good governance, the West always push it back and say, Africans. They want the rest of the world to believe they don't have the pedigree, the power to influence this good governance. Why is it always so?
Yeah, okay. Again, we have to go to history. If you remember, not that long ago, when it was the Soviet Union against the United States, the Soviets had their clients in Africa, and the West had their clients in Africa. And at that point, everybody spoke about democracy, but the fact was the Soviets had their dictators, speaking of people like Mengistu, and the United States had their dictators, speaking of people like Sergeant Doe in Liberia. Right. So everybody spoke a good game about democracy, but at the end of the day, if somebody was on one side or the other, they were given a great deal of latitude. Soviet Union comes to an end. Africa has, I would posit, quite an optimistic decade in the 1990s, and then moving forward into 2000. We have a lot of elections where we did not have elections before. Presidents change. Opposition leaders come out of jail and move into the presidential palaces. Then we have 2001. And then the whole focus again turns on terrorism, extremism, and the global fight against terrorism. Hopefully, and I will say hopefully, we are at the stage now where Africa can be Africa, when Africa can actually look after its own interests. It turns out, and I think the world will realize very quickly, that in effect, Africa will be the Saudi Arabia of the 21st century, because Africa will have all of those treasures that the economy of the 21st century needs. And then Africa has one other phenomenal thing, which nobody else does, and that's the youth tsunami. Africa will have the youngest population, will represent probably the largest single component of young people on earth, who I'm sure the rest of the world will look at as consumers. So, Africa has tremendous potential, and I'm praying that finally, Africa can live up to it.
So the final question on Somaliland, and then we'll move over to what is going on in Cameroon. Do you see the U.S. championing the recognition of Somaliland as an independent nation? Forget about a referendum.
I hope so. I absolutely hope so. And I can tell you, everybody thinks that the United States, it's the president who makes foreign policy, which is not true. In the United States, there are many, many components that figure into making foreign policy. Congress has a great deal. The private sector, businesses have a great deal, but also the communities. And as you well know, being in Houston, that those African diasporas that are politically active have a great deal of political influence with American politicians. So I detect within Washington now a growing sympathy for recognition of Somaliland. So that's why I said that I am more optimistic today than I have been before that the United States will move in that direction.
And talking about the recognition of Somaliland, you know that one conflict that has also been ongoing, which is also about recognition, is that of the southern Cameroon's Ambazonia. And a number of solutions have been suggested to address the root causes to the ongoing conflict between Cameroon and of course, again, the southern Cameroon's Ambazonia for a long-lasting peace through a justice approach, an all-inclusive dialogue, which the Cameroon government referred to as a grand national dialogue, was considered flawed, even by you, sir, because it erroneously considered the conflict an internal problem. Hence, it failed to address the root causes, and it didn't include the conflicting parties. I am here referring to southern Cameroonians or Ambazonians across the globe. Ambazonians say a referendum will be considered a repetition. In other words, southern Cameroonians really do not want a referendum. It will be considered a repetition because United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1608 of 21st April 1960 granted independence to the southern Cameroons as a result of a plebiscite of February 11, 1961, in which the indigents of the southern Cameroons, then called British Trust Territory, expressed their will to be independent. 64 countries voted in that resolution to grant the southern Cameroons their independence. Now, however, of course, we are all aware of the referendum that took place later on, in which the two parts of Cameroons came under one umbrella. But in the advent of this recent conflict, 3 surveys conducted in the course of the conflict have had southern Cameroonians expressing their will to be an independent nation, an independent country. The first one was conducted by Cardinal Christian Toomey, whom I believe you know so well. The results showed 69% of Ambazonians, they want their own country. Then another one was conducted by the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiation, which also indicated that 86% of Ambazonians, they want their independence. Then another one was also conducted very recently by CD from the ground. Back in Ambazonia, 68.5% concluded that Ambazonians want their independence. Now, there is also this idea of a neutral third-party mediation resonating through the U.S. bipartisan Senate Resolution 684 of January 1st, 2021, which has been the most internationally endorsed solution as of date. Mr. Ambassador, sir, you were in Cameroon visiting with Paul Biya at the advent of this conflict, and I believe you had a message for him from the U.S. administration. Before I delve into the premise of this monologue I just presented to you, I'd like you to know, what message did you take to Mr. Biya, sir?
Well, when I was in service, the U.S. government position was we very much supported the entirety of the Cameroonian state, and we urged the Cameroonian government to do everything possible to resolve the long-standing issue with the Anglophone areas. So basically it was a message of please do everything possible to solve this problem before it does get to the point where there's going to be a secession between the two parts of Cameroon.
And you are very much aware, Mr. Ambassador, the Cameroon government, the president in particular, really addresses the media or the press. And so nobody is really sure of what kind of assurances you received from him during that visit. What was his response to you, sir?
Well, that was not, here's the thing. Number one, we don't go into the intimacies of private communication, between countries. But I'll tell you one thing, every meeting I have had with Cameroonian officials, whether it was in Washington, whether it was at the United Nations in New York, whether it was in Yaoundé, the issue of Anglophone Cameroon always came up. The United States, let's also talk about Cameroon itself, because for the United States, it is a very complicated relationship with Cameroon, because as you well know, there's two conflicts going on in Cameroon. One of them is very much part of the global fight against extremism, which is in far north part of Cameroon, Lake Chad area, at Boko Haram, ISIS affiliates there. So in that regard, the United States had to work very closely with the Cameroonian state to help Cameroon fend off the extremists. Then on the other hand, you have this horrendous problem going on in Anglophone part of Cameroon, where the Cameroonian government is in effect at a certain conflict with its own population. So the United States, on the one hand, had to work cooperatively with the Cameroonians on the northern problem, but at the same time, take them to task for committing human rights violations, excuse me, and violence against the Anglophone population. So that's kind of the background to the overall relationship. And then you had different parts, again, of the US government, foreign policy establishment, focusing on different areas. But overlaying all of this, of course, is the ongoing problem that as long as the Cameroonian government treats the Anglophone population as second-class citizens, the problem will never go away.
Well, you capture it right there at the end, treating Anglophones as second-class citizens, and the problem will never go away. It is not going away. Ambazonians, they come across very, very resolved to fight until they get their own free country. Now, as you heard from me, there have been quite a number of solutions to resolve this conflict. Number one, you have the so-called Grand National Dialogue that Yaoundé hosted. There has also been the Swiss initiative aimed at mediating an end to the conflict. Now, you have suggested very, very recently that if Cameroon thinks that they can win this war by the military, it is not going to happen. And at least for the first time in one of your tweets, you mentioned Ambazonia. Mr. Ambassador, that was a little strange, because you maybe because you are out of power now, so you could do that maybe. But honestly, Mr. Ambassador, Ambazonians, there are millions watching out there today, and we have close to 2,000 who are watching just on Facebook alone. In your mind, of course, you have said you are not here to put out U.S. policy, because you are no longer there, but you were there just about a year ago. In your mind, what do you see to be a solution to the conflict between the southern Cameroons and Cameroon? Do you see going back to the root causes, talking about independence for Ambazonia as per UN General Assembly Resolution 1608 happening, sir?
Here's the deal. I question the processes you mentioned, because are they processes to have a process, or are they processes to have a real outcome? To me, if something is just to have a process, then it's a total waste of time. That's one. Number two, and this I've never been able to get an answer for. The Anglophone population, do they have any kind of a hierarchy of leadership that could participate in some kind of a conference? Or is it a totally divided grouping where you have different people speaking for themselves? In other words, it is much easier to have some kind of a genuine conference if you're sitting across from somebody who absolutely represents their side. Right now, I understand that the Cameroonian government can play all kinds of games by, having these conferences, and then the people they're talking to do they really have real power? Do they have representation? Do they have a constituency? We can talk about surveys, but who knows the correctness of the data that's behind the surveys? In other words, to have a real summit, to have a real process that will lead to an outcome, you need to have participants who represent somebody. So I don't personally, and even while I was in office, I never got a sense of the Anglophone side and who represents who. Now, as you well know, whenever there's an independence struggle, what usually happens, unfortunately, is that sooner or later the most violent group takes charge of the entire independence struggle. We've seen that over and over and over again. And is that what is happening in this struggle? I don't know. Number two, is the Cameroonian diaspora, especially in the United States, are they united? Because as you well know, the Ethiopian diaspora is terribly divided. You have two segments that are much as war at each other with words as the sides there. Are there genuine representatives of the Cameroonian diaspora that can engage with U.S. Political forces, whether it's members of Congress or going to the State Department and talking? Because as you well know, in America, our politicians pay attention to the voters. Our politicians pay attention to political forces because the United States has so many interests around the world, and they take up so much of the attention of the United States that unless there is a political force behind any particular issue, it is not going to be looked at in a long-term serious way. So those are the questions, that the American government would have to see. Number one, are the Anglophones united in the solution that they absolutely want? Number two, are there genuine representatives of the Anglophone population who really do speak for the entire population as opposed to a small group? And number three, has the Cameroonian government absolutely just played games and not been serious in any kind of process, so that the Anglophones have absolutely every right to take their grievances on the road to independence, so that it would eventually lead to an independent Ambazonia?
Mr. Ambassador, sir, we have heard this theme of division within the southern Cameroon's populace again and again and again. But won't you agree that, just as you've quoted Ethiopia, won't you agree that in every conflict or movement such as that of Cameroon and the southern Cameroons, you will always have divisions, isn't it? For example, in apartheid South Africa, they did not all agree. People like Chief Buthelezi, though they wanted some rights for the black majority, were fraternizing with the white minority. Even in the USA, when they fought for a free America, there was a faction who would prefer to remain with England. So you have in the southern Cameroon struggle, I think basically the same kind of division. And so I believe to expect that everybody in the leadership comes under the same tent and agree on the same principle is kind of unrealistic, isn't it?
However, in the United States, even as you say, a majority of the Americans actually wanted to stay with Great Britain. The rebel side did have a command structure. They did have a political hierarchy. So for me, again, I'm speaking just for myself, but for the Anglophone Cameroonians to provide credible alternatives, they really should present a unified side, a unified structure, so that, you know, it's the same people that show up, whether it's in London, whether it's in Washington. And as we all know, we have to speak reality here in Paris. Because as long as the Cameroonian government can say, oh, it's a bunch of divided, you know, this person represents 100 people, this person represents 200 people, and oh, by the way, this person, all they do is kill school teachers, you know, who want to try and teach students. So, you know, I'm just being practical, because members of Congress are not going to have time to see 12 different spokespeople for the, you know, for the Anglophone Cameroonians.
Mr. Ambassador, sir, you have been on this issue for, I mean, since it escalated.
Since 1991.
Right. Are you not aware that there is the interim government of Ambazonia that is essentially prosecuting the war on the ground? It commands the fighting force on the ground, and it commands the diplomatic aspect of the struggle.
Do they have a foreign minister?
They do, sir.
Well,
are you saying that you were never contacted during your tenure in office?
No, I was not. I was absolutely not. I had many, many visits from the Cameroonian government and the Cameroonian embassy, but I was never once contacted by somebody, you know, who was allegedly the foreign minister of the whole Anglophone cause. And, you know, we need to get the practicalities. You know, I deal in the practical and the realistic, not the ideological or the, you know, the ideal. That's the kind of thing that needs publicity. It needs the Cameroonian communities to promote it, and it needs a fairly somewhat, you know, diplomatic outreach. As we have discussed, of course, Somaliland is a functioning state. So for Somaliland, it's quite easy to, you know, send around their representatives. But during the American War of Independence, you know how active the revolutionaries were in promoting the point of view of those who wanted to break away from England.
Apart from the division that you just mentioned, what would you be expecting the Ambazonian diaspora, the interim government again that prosecutes the struggle, to be doing, sir?
Well, if they're that interested, they better be sending delegations to Congress and corresponding with their members of Congress, writing op-eds for the newspapers. I'll tell you, during my time as Assistant Secretary, I think in those years I heard from a handful of members of Congress. There was one member of Congress that I really applauded because he was very, very proactive in this regard. But it was not what I would say a, you know, kind of a hardcore effort or some kind of a, you know, political movement.
Now, when we talk, I'd like you to take a moment and just listen to this comment that you put out. This was during a hearing in the Congress. I think this was in 2019.
When I was still working for the government.
Right.
Well, everything's on the table moving forward, but we have to bring this situation to an end. Else, there's a possibility of what happened in Nigeria with Boko Haram. Started as a small movement, and now look at it. And it'd be a disastrous for the region if the Cameroonian government turned this thing into yet another type of Boko Haram.
And then also
The Cameroonian government established several commissions, and I'm sorry, I don't know the exact name of it, whether it's the Multicultural Institution for National Reconciliation or something, which on the face of it sounds good, but the institution, and there have been a couple of these, but they have not been provided adequate budget, and they have not really done anything.
Mr. Ambassador, each time I listen to you make a comment on this crisis, you come across always sounding like frustrated that the Cameroon government just hasn't done enough and doesn't have any intention to do enough to bring this conflict to an end. Why is the international community not running down some sanctions on the regime in spite of the thousands, sir, that the military in Cameroon continues to kill? And you have seen images of charred towns and villages caused by the Cameroon army. Why is the international community really not doing enough, sir?
Do you want the diplomatic answer or the real answer?
The real answer, sir.
All right. Now, and I have to add one thing. I would get, you well know, because you see the pictures too, these awful, god-awful photos of the human rights violations being committed by the security forces. And then, of course, the Cameroonian ambassador shows up with his own book, that shows pictures of teachers who've had their hands cut off and gendarmes, who have been killed. So the violations are awful, no matter who commits them against who. But for the international community is seized with so many crises in so many places that there's only 24 hours in the day to focus on one crisis or another. That's why, unfortunately, whether it is Cameroon, whether it is Somalia, whether it is Eastern Congo, whether it is Myanmar, these awful crises which go on and on forever, and people are losing their lives, and women are being raped, and there's horrible abuses, they just tend to be under the radar of the international community as opposed to an Afghanistan. So that's why I'm saying that to give these types of crises the focus that they deserve, there needs to be political mobilization, and people need to point to it themselves in engaging with their political leadership. You mentioned a minute ago that every time in my recordings, I sound frustrated in that I don't think that the Cameroonian government is taking it seriously. And of course, I'm frustrated, and I was always frustrated. I was frustrated the first day I came on the job because, of course, they weren't taking it seriously. They were going through a process. They were going through delaying tactics. They were just hoping that this situation goes away. And since I'm a historian, my history tells me that the situation is not going to go away. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. That's why when I alluded to Boko Haram, when Boko Haram first started, they started with words, and then they went to machetes, and then they went to guns, and then they went to bombs, and then they went to armored personnel carriers. And these types of conflicts just have a way to grow and grow and grow. And then when the government finally pays attention, it is way out of control. I mean, you and I both know that early when this crisis started, the Cameroon government, by exercising genuine goodwill, could have ended it very, very quickly. They did not. And, whatever data you cite for surveys, I'm sure that today there are many more people who favor an independent Ambazonia than there were when the polls were taken. So to me, it is a huge tragedy. It's an unnecessary tragedy. And the Cameroonian government, by exercising wisdom, could have ended it. But I go back to the fundamental point I made, that as long as the Cameroonian government looks at its Anglophone population as second-class citizens, then the conflict is going to go on.
Ambassador Sir, so much has been said about the root causes of the conflict, and I will ask you, what, according to your understanding, are the root causes to the conflict? I mean, you live in Cameroon, and I'm sure you have a little bit good grip on the history of the two Cameroons.
Yeah, here's my take. I traveled all over Cameroon. Of course, I was very good friends with John Fruindi, and I remember driving to Bamenda once to investigate the killing of some demonstrators. And I get to Bamenda and I meet with the governor, who's a francophone and doesn't speak English. I meet with the commander of the military region, who's a francophone and doesn't speak any English. And I said to myself, as long as the government assigns people to the Anglophone regions who cannot even honestly communicate with the people that they're supposed to be engaging with, it is a losing policy. I flipped this around. I think you've heard me mention this before, because the Cameroonian situation is very similar to the Canadian situation, except in Canada, 80% of the population is Anglophone, 20% Francophone. In Cameroon, it's 80% Francophone, 20% Anglophone. And in Canada, they have gone out of their way to make sure that the 20% Francophones feel like they are a part of Canada. As a matter of fact, when any Canadian official makes a speech, the one page is in French and the next page is in English, and it goes on like that. It is inconceivable for a Canadian politician to not be fluent in both English and French. And until the Cameroonian government gets this through their head, the Anglophone population is always going to be made feel like second-class citizens.
Now, when you spoke to Congress a while ago, still in the, I think 2019, you made reference to what U.S. policy is. And you stated in that presentation that U.S. policy is to maintain the current borders of Cameroon. We're wondering what you mean by the current borders. Do you see the possibility, sir, in the future of the U.S. recognizing the borders of the southern Cameroons at independence?
Again, I can't speak for U.S. policy.
What is your opinion on that, sir?
But let's be realistic. U.S. policy, as any policy in the world, undergoes change. So if circumstances on the ground change dramatically, then of course we could posture that U.S. policy would change with that. When I was speaking, I was reflecting the U.S. policy of the day. So you have to ask my successor, Assistant Secretary Fee, or the Secretary of State, to see what the possibilities are. But of course, U.S. policy changes as we discussed with Somaliland, because who knows where that will go.
All right. Let me get to probably one of those last questions here. As you know, one of the things on the table again is the Swiss mediation. And as you know, it has gone on now. I think this is 3 years, the third year of the Swiss initiative. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of international pressure. International weight behind the Swiss mediation to put require pressure on Cameroon to get to the table. Don't you think that countries like the United States, the UK, Canada could do more to assist the Swiss get Cameroon to the negotiation table?
Yeah, again, I wish I could go into some of the private discussions that I had on this very issue, because you are articulating some of the same frustrations that I shared at the time. The problem was, again, as long as there was a quote unquote process going on, it's fairly easy for the international community to point to that and say, well, there's a process in place, so let's just see where that process, ends up. So as I mentioned before, unfortunately, it seems to me to be a process to just have a process, and there's not going to be any sharp outcome. Again, looking at history, I fear that to move the process along is going to take some very dramatic events happening, because right now, look around at the world, look around at the headlines, and there is just no international attention going there right now.
What could be done to get that international attention, especially on the part of Southern Cameroonians?
Well, as I mentioned before, it would be a lot easier if the Southern Cameroonians came up with one very clearly defined leadership structure that could start engaging the various countries around the world. The United Kingdom, I know, is very interested. Of course, we all know that one of the key countries would be France. The United States, there are certainly members of Congress and the State Department and the White House people are interested, and get the Cameroonian diaspora, especially in the United States, to start engaging their members of Congress.
Talking about France, recently in one of your tweets, you regretted that the French are not doing enough to get Cameroon to commit to negotiating an end to this conflict.
Yes, that goes to one of my greatest frustrations. I'm not going to give you the details on that, but rest assured, again, I did everything I could, to get them interested in this. You remember, to be fair, you have to look again. The United States and France have a range of very, very extensive relations, and even in Africa, the United States and France are engaged together very closely combating extremism in the Sahel. So, the Cameroon is just one phase. It's just one phase of the relationship between the United States and France.
Are you suggesting so that the United States is kind of hand-tied because of the friendship with France to push for anything that could bring the conflict to an end?
No, I wouldn't. I would not go to that extent to say the hands tied. All I would say is that it's a very broad relationship with France, and if the problems in the Sahel is what is demanding all of the attention, then the others are not going to get the same amount of attention. That's what I'm saying. Ratchet up the political. Always politics matters in these kinds of things. And there is a very vocal, active Cameroonian population in the United States. They just have to be politically engaged to express, their rights under the U.S. Constitution of petitioning their members of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I will crave for your indulgence for a few more minutes, please, if you can. I'd like to open the phone lines and take maybe 2 or 3 questions directly for you. But why I open the phone line, please? Again, I go back to the Southern Cameroon's diaspora. What would be your candid advice to the leadership? You may not be very much aware of how the setup is, but I can assure you the Southern Cameroon has a very dynamic diaspora leadership. What would be your advice to them, Mr. Ambassador?
My advice would be personal engagement with members of Congress in their offices, and with the staffers, with the staff of the various committees, because it's all well and good to write letters to newspapers and 20-page academic treatises, but let's be honest, there's so many issues that are being followed that's not going to, as we say in America, move the needle. Moving the needle it means political engagement.
Thank you, sir. I will take This caller here, I guess he has a question for you. Hello.
Chris.
Hello, sir.
Greetings, Chris. This is Prince Jake. I want to say great interview with the Ambassador Tibor Nagy there. I just want to ask one quick question to Ambassador Tibor Nagy. He has been talking in regards to unity in purpose. I want him to talk or to tell the people of Southern Cameroon's Ambazonia what he thinks like is our way focus, like our way to push forward with the revolution, because he has been saying like we are divided. You have one leader here with 100 people. Is he in any way trying to tell the people of Ambazonians that if we have to succeed in this war, we have to all come up in one group in a unifying purpose, or with one group with a unifying focus?
All right, thank you. Thank you. Let Ambassador to your question, please. Mr. Ambassador, sir.
Yeah, you know, I cannot be a cheerleader for the conflict. Yeah, I mean, you know that. But all I can say is, you know, people have a right for their petitions to be heard. People need to organize. They need to decide what their goals are, how best to pursue those goals. And they have to make their wishes known to those people who are in influence, you know, whether it's going to the United Nations, whether it's, you know, going to members of the U.S. government, whether it's going to the British government, and yes, engaging with the French government, because all of the, you know, everybody that has an interest and an involvement in this needs to be engaged, including you have to talk about Nigeria, because Nigeria has huge critical interests in what happens on its Cameroonian border.
I wish we had much more time to get into a little bit into that particular angle with Nigeria, but let me get to the next caller here. Hello.
Hello, Patrick Chris. This is Patrick calling from the state of Indiana.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for coming to this show and to listen to the plight of the Ambazonian people. I would like to know, since you were Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and you are not still there now, do you still have conversations with those who are there about what is going on in Cameroon to advise them on what they can do to help the situation?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, please.
Yeah, obviously, you know, those of us in the U.S. government, whether we are Democrats or Republicans or nonpartisan, who follow Africa, it's not a very big group, so everybody knows each other. I will say the Cameroonians, all of them, are lucky to be getting the next ambassador, Ambassador Chris Lamora. Ambassador Chris had an earlier tour in Cameroon. I think he arrived in Douala about the time that I was finishing my time there, when I was deputy ambassador to Ambassador Cook. So yes, the people who are involved in Africa do engage with each other, and Cameroon has been one of the big concerns amongst American Africanists since the problems have started, because unfortunately, I think a lot of people saw the way the situation was going to go.
Okay, this is the last question. This is a caller calling from Germany. Hello.
Yes, hello. This is Dr. Awa. I got a question for the ambassador. I have in front of me UN Resolution 1608 of April 21st, April 1961, with a vote for the independence of the Southern Cameroons, 64 against 23. And I see among the countries that voted for the independence of the Southern Cameroons, the United States of America. They actually voted for the Southern Cameroons to get their independence. But somehow the Southern Cameroons is being ruled by a neighboring country that got its own independence on the 1st of January 1960. Please, Mr. Ambassador, can you really give me your own interpretation of this resolution 1608 of 21st April 1961?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, I think that's quite an interesting question there, because when 64 countries vote to give a country independence, it turned out it is independent by joining. That never happened then to any other nation in the 60s, right?
Yeah, right. The easy answer to the gentleman's question is no, I cannot, because I am not that familiar with that much history regarding the origins of the dual Cameroonian states. But I think, Chris, didn't you mention that shortly after that there was another resolution which actually led to the coming together of the two portions, and that there were votes taken in what had been the British Trust territory, and some parts of it joined up with Nigeria, and other parts of it decided to form the Federation of Cameroon, which then eventually, I forget, was it President Ahijo or President Dia who did away with who did away with the Federation. So I think that there were certain steps of that old history, that there were subsequent actions after the resolution that the gentleman mentioned.
Mr. Ambassador, I am really thankful for you coming on ABS. I will be coming back to you once in a while to get your take on African issues. For your information, sir, ABS is fairly new, broadcasting to all of Africa, and it is a news channel that covers African issues. And again, I shall be returning to you for some other African issues in the course of the time. I really want to appreciate you for coming on board, sir.
Thank you very much, and let's continue praying for the very issues you talked about.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Tibor Nagy.